Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Mecha Mondays. I am your, yes, intrepid, intrepid pilot Frag, pilot narrator now, Fragath, and today we'll be continuing through our read-through of the Mobile Suit Gundam Novelization. Previously on, Kusko Al bit it, regrettably. We knew her so little time, but her death in this is actually feels honestly more impactful than Lalah Sune's does. Um, Partly because you kind of know what's coming with Lalah Sune, particularly if you've seen the series, but you're not really sure how Cusco Al is going to go down, and it's actually really depressing. She has not lived a happy life, sadly, so that she's managed to be as upstanding and self-asserting as she has been, considering her past, is honestly really impressive, and of course increases the tragedy from Amuro Ray killing her, which he's not happy about. But again, it's a case of he's not really in control of his actions at a certain point. Partly because things are happening so quickly, you don't necessarily get a good sense of that, but things are moving very fast during these scenes. But like Tomino puts everything on pause, so you see every little thing that's happening, even though it's happening so quickly that these pilots, even with their enhanced senses and abilities, are really having a great deal of difficulty reacting in time. Um, in this case, again, could he have pulled out and not killed her? Maybe, but he was possessed by the spirit of the moment, sadly, which maybe is giving him too much credit. I don't know. Or giving him a break when he doesn't necessarily deserve one. But uh, Amuro, and this is something I generally give credit to Tomino in his writing for. Amuro is very, very messy. He's a very messy character. He is far from perfect. Um, he's a bit of an Ubermenschen, but at the same time, he's also kind of a dink. So, and that comes through really well. And that's kind of something you see a lot in a bunch of Tomino's writing is like even when you've got like the designated this is a good guy character and they are doing their best and you are either supposed to like them or sympathize with them or otherwise they're the protagonist running the show, um, they're still pretty deeply flawed. Um, this is almost universally true. I think the characters that are it's least true for are maybe Uso Ebbing, um, from Victory Gundam, maybe. Well, Loran is just very. Loran Sihak from Turn A is very human as well, but he's not, I guess, as deeply flawed. Although he is kind of flawed, it's more about the rest of the cast. Um, and flaw doesn't necessarily mean bad thing. It just means they're they have foibles. They're not this perfect expression. They're not you know they can't do everything they set their mind on, but they try. Um, Turn A isn't really about Loran, it's really about the setting, but that's another discussion. Um, Great examples of flawed protagonists in Tomino works. What's his name from Oro Battler Dunbine? Show? I think his name is. I don't remember his last name. Very flawed. Another example of he does pretty well, but he's kind of a dink. Like when stuff's right in front of him, he just completely misses it. It's like, oh come on, dude. This person is trying to tell you something. Maybe pay a little attention, please. Thank you. Anyway, Tomino is quite good at that, even with his characters that seem downright insane. And one of his hallmarks is like characters who are having a conversation, even though neither party is hearing the other, which comes across very, very strangely when animated, but does kind of make sense because it's largely to represent these are people coming from very different viewpoints and they have their own thing going on, and it's maybe done in a way that's bizarre, but like characters even in a situation where they are conversing with each other face to face will talk right past each other because they've got their own thing going on, and that seems crazy and can drive you crazy until you get used to it. But it does make it feel more believable in some ways, or at least makes the characters feel human, which I think a lot of writers have do tend to struggle with. You can't blame them. It's not easy to do that. All right, so yeah, we are done with the second book of this trilogy. And now we're getting started on the next, which is Volume 3, Confrontation by Yoshiyuki Tomino. Chapter 17, Power and Ambition. I'm just speculating, but if we could be absolutely certain the Federation forces really were going to converge around Abo Aku, then I... To Admiral Chapman Jiron's surprise, his superior, Giran Zabi, the supreme commander of the Principality of Zeon, faltered in mid-sentence. For a man who normally spoke with unswerving conviction, even when the two of them were alone, it was utterly out of character. I've been thinking, Giran finally continued, that we could make Abo Aku one of the targets for the system plan. Well, what do you think? His last words were rushed, as if he were overly self-conscious. Chapman was horrified. If I understand you correctly, Excellency, he said tentatively, you're ordering me to employ the system in our current campaign. If so, sir, I beg to reply that it is impossible. Giran twisted his head and popped the joints in his neck. What's the matter, Admiral? He said, his voice suddenly hardening. You're not worried about Dozle, Caecilia, and Randolph, are you? Chapman knew Giran was angry at him for his weak-kneed response, but he knew what Giran was really suggesting, targeting Abo Aku as part of a plan to annihilate Dozle and Caecilia Zabi, Giran's own brother and sister, so he could rule unchallenged in a new post-war era. And because no witnesses could be permitted to survive such a dastardly attack, Vice Admiral Randolph Wiegelman, Giran's own right-hand man and commanding officer on Abo Aku, would also have to be sacrificed. There was no other way to explain the earlier hesitation and tone. But Chapman wasn't completely surprised. He had long suspected Giran might someday cook up such a diabolical scheme. They ought to be able to hold off the Federation forces long enough for us to complete the project, Giran added. Don't you agree? Why, yes, sir. Chapman stroked his mustache with his ring finger and stared down at some notes on Giran's desk in front of him. You're quite right, I'm sure, sir. The parties you mention, after all, do command some of our crack units. He wished he had never heard Giran's words, and he wished he knew nothing about Giran's plans. But it was too late. He knew. And now his own position was in danger. Giran would be watching every move he made, listening to every word he uttered. And eventually, he, Chapman, would have no choice except to execute Giran's crazy idea. Nonetheless, he raised his gaze to meet Giran's and finally managed to blurt out, But the conditions are too difficult, sir. Giran stood up and pushed a button on his on his expansive office desk. The left and right wall panels rose up, revealing a giant 4-meter square screen. Sorry, revealing revealing giant 4-meter square screens that showed the universe unfolding before them. Well, why? Speak frankly, Admiral.
We can't control where the Federation Armada is finally going to concentrate its strength, sir, and we have no guarantee that use of the system will terminate the war. As long as that is true, I believe your plan is impossible to carry out, sir.
I see your point, but surely it's possible to use the system for something less than a single point attack? Can't we use it to sort of rake their forces? Eh, Chapman?
Well, I suppose so.
System was the code name of a top-secret Zeon project to convert a cylindrical space colony over 6 kilometers in diameter into a giant laser cannon. Using this solar ray to rake the enemy presented several technical problems, not the least of which was the fact that the angle of fire could be tweaked only between 3 and 5 degrees. But as long as the target was tens of thousands of kilometers removed, even that would easily cover an entire combat zone. It would not even be necessary to wait for all the Federation ships to converge at one point. If, however, as Giran seemed to imply, the goal was also to annihilate certain friendly forces, Zeon forces, and make it look like an accident, the plan would have to be perfectly executed. They would need double, even triple guarantees that it would work as designed. Giran continued. I've already had Rank Kiproden, the president of Side 6, which, as you know, is ostensibly neutral, sound out the possibility of a negotiated peace settlement afterward with the Federation.
And is there such a possibility, sir?
Chapman immediately regretted asking the question so soon. Giran would probably pounce on him for it. You could say so, Giran answered mysteriously. He then turned away from the wall screens and walked in front of Chapman. He smiled thinly, and Chapman instinctively stood at attention, holding his files at his side. He knew Giran had made a decision. I'll leave the timing of the attack up to you, Giran said, casually sitting down at his desk again. Can you do it?
With with one condition, sir, Chapman haltingly replied. I need at least 3 days to bring the system up to 80% of its potential power. I need you to wait till then.
Sorry, of its power potential.
I need you to wait till then.
Our campaign, Operation Revol 1, has already begun. If the tides of war go against us, we may need to fire the system as early as this afternoon.
But, sir!
Chapman closed his eyes, raised his voice, and lodged the strongest protest he was capable of. The system was only 50% powered up, and to make up the difference he would have to rush work on the over 500 microchannels that linked Mahal with the solar batteries. Mahal is the name of the colony cylinder. It was obviously impossible, but that was just a technical issue. The moral issue was more complex. Chapman Jerome was, however, an admiral with considerable personal ambition. He had been given a chance to win the favor and trust of the Supreme Commander, and he knew that if he succeeded, his future would be bright. If the war could be concluded on favorable terms, he would probably be treated like one of the Zabi family. In fact, without Dozle and Caecilia Zabi around to interfere, he would probably be given a position in power second only to the Supreme Commander himself. At the same time, Chapman was a fairly rational man, fully aware of what could happen to him if he linked himself too closely to Giran's fate.
Giran had, after all, just decided to sacrifice one of his most trusted men, not to mention thousands of his troops and his own sister. But if he, Chapman, worked fast now to help Giran eradicate potential future problems such as Dozle and Caecilia, he was convinced he could avoid Randolph's impending fate. Going along with Giran, he quickly concluded, was a gamble, but it would be worth it. The only obstacle left, he suddenly thought, will be Giran's father, Degwin, and he's just a puppet. In the end, his naive optimism in his own future and his limited understanding of the political scheming in Zeon won out. I know this plan entails an element of risk, Admiral, Giran said. That's why I wanted to consult with you first. I don't have a hotline to General Revel on the Federation side, and can't call him up and tell him to slow down. But I think I can spare some ships now dedicated to the defense of the fatherland, and thus gain you another 48 hours.
Thank you, sir, Chapman gushed. With 2 days, I'm sure we can bring the system power output up to at least 70%. If you can just hold the targets in place, it'll work.
Good. I'm depending on you, Chapman. Giran whispered, oh, sorry. Good. I'm depending on you, Chapman. Giran whispered his final sentence, but Chapman understood its significance. Giran, Supreme Commander Giran Zabi, had called him Chapman Jerome, not by rank, but by name. It meant he had become the Supreme Commander's friend. He clicked the heels of his boots together, saluted, and exited his superior's office. Giran watched as Chapman departed. Chapman was around 45, and, he congratulated himself, probably just the right age and temperament for the job. Then he turned and looked at the wall displays he had activated earlier. They showed an enlarged real image of the space colonies that comprised the Principality of Zeon, silhouetted by the sun. Most Zeon colonies were of the sealed cylinder type, and on their periphery had from 6 to 8 giant solar cell panels that supplied the residents inside with all the energy they needed. There were 2 reasons Zeon did not use the type of cylinder common elsewhere in space, the type with 3 or more giant mirrors to reflect natural light inside, and instead used sealed cylinders. First, the centrifugal force generated by colony rotation simulated Earth gravity on the enormous inside walls of the cylinder, and made it possible to use them for living space. A closed cylinder, with no transparent glass sections to let in light, meant that the entire wall area could be used as ground, and that the colonies could house far more people. Most Zeon colonies held up to 20 million people in 70-kilometer-long cylinders as wide as 18 kilometers in diameter. Second, it was believed that even the old models of sealed cylinder colonies gave residents superior protection from harmful radiation during solar storms. Enough time had passed so that the 3rd generation of colony residents was now emerging, and they appeared healthy, but there was still no guarantee that people in space would be safe forever. The sealed cylinders of Side 3, or what became the Principality of Zeon, had been built as a type of experiment. Instead of natural sunlight, a configuration of pipe-like structures resembling old-fashioned fluorescent lights ran through the core of the Zeon colony cylinders, serving as an artificial sun and providing a regulated 24-hour cycle of day and night. As in Federation colonies, in the Principality adjustments were made in the length of the day to replicate Earth-style seasons and form a human mean time among various cylinders. It was a system that had proved quite successful, and there was little likelihood of change in the future. Sometimes people who emigrated to Side 3 complained because the seasons approximated those of the temperate zones in Earth's northern hemisphere, and in the early days, whenever an immigrant from a tropical region or from the southern hemisphere became an official of the Mean Time Control Agency, he or she would ritually propose a change. But in recent years, the populations seem to have accepted the status quo, or forgotten the difference. Girin loved to look at the display of Zeon's colonies. From such a distant perspective, everything seemed so peaceful. As those around him often cautiously joked behind his back, their supreme commander acted like a feudal lord, gazing with self-satisfaction at the happy, productive lives of the lowly subjects in his dominion.
He acts all high and mighty, his head in the clouds, some whispered, even though his feet are still in the gutter.
But he also loved to gaze at the sight of the Milky Way. If he squinted his eyes just right when he looked at the wall displays, the millions of stars blurred into a mysterious, beautiful, glowing river through the sky and made him marvel at its vastness and ponder the meaning of life. That he was capable of such philosophical introspection would have surprised his aides, for Girin was often assumed to be plotting what the civilian ratio. For Girin was often assumed to be plotting what military to civilian ratio should exist on a specific colony, or whom to reshuffle or demote. But as far as Girin was concerned, those were mere details, to be decided with a glance at the appropriate forms or the information regularly appearing on his monitor screens. He didn't need to gaze at the universe to make such mundane decisions. The gazing was done for the sake of gazing. Any thoughts generated by it were far more vast in scope. Girin was fascinated with what could be accomplished with hundreds of colonies, and with what they implied about human potential. If, as people said, the universe was infinite in size, men should act more boldly and assert themselves on a far grander scale than they had on Earth. "There's no physical population problem out here," Girin muttered to himself, looking out at the universe. 10 or 20 billion people are no threat to the natural order of things, but we can do without the baser element. They only hold the rest of us back. They're worse than scum. Then he suddenly started to worry about Mahal. He made the display cameras pan until the full moon came into view on the screens. He couldn't see Mahal yet, but he could discern a few other colonies rotating in space with their huge solar cells deployed. Regularly scheduled transports plied their way between them, their red and green lights blinking in the blackness. Then he spotted it. Mahal was one of the earliest and therefore smallest sealed colonies built. 6 kilometers in diameter and 30 kilometers in length, it had been specially chosen for the system project. Its citizens had all been evacuated, its inner walls had been coated with aluminum, and it had been turned into a giant carbon dioxide laser cannon. Because the power requirements for the project were staggering, and because there was so little time, Girin had used emergency measures to harness energy from nearly 1/3 of all the solar cells in the Principality. But doing so had required appeals to the masses to conserve energy and make yet further sacrifices. He knew he had to keep appealing to their pride and reinforce in them the idea that they were a chosen, blessed people. If not, he ran the risk of creating fear and dissension, even fostering an anti-war movement. Governing might become difficult, and the last thing he wanted to do was sow the seeds of his own destruction by encouraging factions that opposed him. It was imperative that the system's strategy lead to quick victory in the war against the Federation. "Humph," he muttered. "Here's hoping Caecilia, Dozle, and Randolph can hold off the Federation attack as long as possible." Girin liked to believe that anything was possible, but at the same time, and in his own way, he knew the dangers of complacency and overconfidence. He knew he was no Napoleon, yet it bothered him that his own father, a puppet whom the Zeon citizenry still fawned upon as the sovereign, had once referred to him as a second-rate Hitler. But his father, he reassured himself, had probably said it out of jealousy more than anything else. He, Girin, had gone to great lengths to maintain his objectivity. For example, he had placed Vice Admiral Randolph Wiegelman, a trusted lieutenant, in charge of the Abo Aku space fortress, and regularly listened to his advice, respecting him as a friend who could always provide it. It was, in fact, Randolph who had provided the inspiration for the idea of destroying Caecilia. "I'm not saying there's not enough room in the solar system for both of you," Randolph had casually said several years earlier, "but your sister's too smart for her own good. She's the type that, if she'd been raised on Earth, would probably have revolted and formed her own Earth Federation." It had been hard for Giron to realize that his baby sister was so clever and scheming. But as Randolph had pointed out, throughout the war she had always tried to promote her own agenda. Not too long ago, for example, he had learned that she was lavishing public funds on the mysterious Flanagan Institute, and around the same time he had begun hearing rumors of Newtypes. Indeed, in the last few months the rumors had begun to take a more tangible form, and among both Federation and Zeon frontline troops it was increasingly said that Newtypes were not just enlightened space-age men and women, as Zeon Zum-Daikun had once prophesied, but extraordinary military warriors capable of finally bringing an end to the war. He had already received a battlefield report to the effect that the Federation had formed its own new type unit, centered on a new mobile suit called a Gundam. And from the reports he received once every 3 days from Lieutenant Chalia Bull, he knew that Caecilia had formed a small unit of Rick-Doms to be her new type unit, that she had put Commander Shar Aznable in charge of it, and that she was already preparing to reinforce it. Clearly, Caecilia was ready for whatever was going to happen. These aren't the new types Zeon talked about, Giron thought. They must have some sort of superpowers. If Giron had begun to overestimate new types, it was partly because of Lieutenant Chalia Bull. He had deliberately planted Chalia in Caecilia's command as a spy without telling him he wanted to destroy Caecilia, but in the course of one meeting the lieutenant had seemed to have read his mind. To Giron, it had seemed like a form of telepathy, and had made him start to believe the rumors about new types. He recalled what the young revolutionary, Zeon Zum-Daikun, had once said. The universe is a new environment which will compel mankind to change. If the first stage in mankind's evolution was his evolution from an ape to a human, and the second stage was his breakthrough from feudalism to the rational science of the Renaissance, then the third will be his transformation into a new type of human, a man with profound sensitivity and insight, and a far greater awareness of the vastness of time and space. The transition to new types will be a natural one. The act of walking increased man's range of movement and helped the concept of tribe and nation-state to develop. Powered vehicles expanded man's awareness to a global level. And now civilization is advancing into outer space. By living and working in space, man's consciousness will transcend the boundaries of Earth and become truly universal. The vastness of space will be home. And as man's consciousness expands, he will begin to tap the unutilized portions of his cerebrum, the over half of his brain cells unused since time immemorial, the enormous untapped mental reserves given by God precisely for the new environment of space. And when this happens, man will change. Man will become a more enlightened, refined, and compassionate being. It is space, the act of living in an extraterrestrial environment, that will act as the trigger. Oh, people of space, now is the time to awaken, to realize your latent potential. We are at the dawn of a transformation of mankind, a true enlightenment of the human race. And we may finally be poised, ready to transcend what has always been thought to be impossible, infinite space and time itself. This is no idle dream. To live in a new universe, man must transcend the psychological limitations of his old environment. The memory of Zeon Daikun's speech was etched into Giron Zabi's brain. His father, Degwin Zabi, had financially backed the young revolutionary's activities. And when a true political movement had coalesced around Zeon Daikun, culminating in the formation of a political party, Giran had been influenced by his father and thrown himself into the movement. But after several years of working with Zeon Daikun, both he and his father had eventually reached the same conclusion. The man's true talents were limited to those of a political agitator. By the time the Zeon movement had begun advocating the autonomy of space colonies in the Earth Federation, Degwin Zabi and Giran had secretly usurped most of its true power, but Zeon Zum Daikun remained a star. He was handsome, impassioned, and the type of man with whom young women fell in love immediately. His charisma was essential to turn the movement into a true political force. As public opinion began to coalesce and to advocate the right of sides to exist as independent states, and the sacredness of Earth as mankind's original home, Degwin and Giran emerged as leaders of the Zeon faction. As Zeon Zum Daikun had often said, geez, these speeches, man. It is the height of arrogance for those who remain on Earth to look up at the heavens and believe that they can continue to rule over all its inhabitants. It is true that we, the space colonists, were largely shipped from Earth against our will as a population control measure. But now we are developing a new identity and awareness. We are a new people. We live, eat, and sleep among the stars. We live in infinite space, and we will have access to infinite energy until the sun burns out 50 billion years from now. Our consciousness will expand, and infinite space will be our true home. God has given us the stars to live among. We are the people of the universe. We have struggled to survive in a harsh environment, and new generations of colonists testify to our success. Now, when we gaze back at Earth, we see a sacred blue and green orb, the cradle of civilization, and a sacred home that we must eternally preserve and protect. Our new consciousness as people of the universe tells us that Earth was not created to be abused and polluted by a few members of an elite, privileged class. Men and women who have never been into outer space still believe Earth belongs to them, and still continue to rape and plunder it, but their time has passed. Earth must be preserved as the sacred homeland of all mankind. It does not belong solely to an earthbound elite. By continuing to dream of controlling all of mankind, they forever deny mankind its true destiny. Autonomy for the sides, sovereignty for the colonies, does not simply mean a revolt against sovereignty on Earth. It means that every human should move into space, that the government of the Earth and the area around it should be placed in the hands of an alliance of all sides, and that the Earth itself should be preserved and protected as the sacred birthplace of all mankind. It is easy to expand the number of colonies required to accomplish this. In ancient times, the Christians fought bloody battles for control of the birthplace of their religion, but there is no need for humanity to repeat this mistake over Earth. Zeon Zum Daikun's ideas struck a sympathetic chord among the colonists on each side, but the absolute democracy of the Earth Federation government also worked in his favor. The internal contradictions of a dictatorship of the majority created endless parliamentary procedures, which resulted in a rash of irresponsible legislation and an obfuscation of responsibility among individual politicians. Even minor policy initiatives invariably resulted in factional fighting among competing bureaucracies. It became impossible to satisfy anyone. Dissatisfaction spread throughout the system. Some agencies of the Earth Federation government were aware of the seriousness of the problems developing, and were sympathetic to the sides, but when a hardline Earth faction took over de facto control of the entire Federation system, its members' prejudices inflamed the desire for autonomy among the sides, and eventually created the conditions for a direct challenge to the authority of the Federation government. By the time the Earth Federation government tried to exercise control over the situation, it was too late. Their actions succeeded only in derailing the emerging Side 3 Republican system. On Side 3, already worsening relations between Degwin Zabi and Zeon Zum Daikun were aggravated when Degwin and Girin conducted a massive purge of their opposition. In UC 0065, which came to be known as the Black Year, a special secret service under the control of Girin eliminated 200,000 members of the anti-Daikun faction. That's insanity. The purge was carried out in a draconian way, entirely contrary to the beliefs of Zeon Zum Daikun. It even created a rift between Degwin and his son, but it did make it possible for Side 3 to successfully declare its independence from the Earth Federation 2 years later, and to officially form a republic. It did not, however, mean that the power struggles within the Republic of Zeon itself were over yet. For 5 years after the Side 3, oh my gosh. For 5 years after Side 3's declaration of independence, Zeon Zum Daikun died suddenly of what was reported as an illness, although rumors persisted that his death might not have been entirely natural. And 3 years after Zeon's death, Degwin declared Side 3 a principality and installed himself at its head. Instead of acting resolutely, the Earth Federation government chose to sit back and watch the power struggle unfolding between the ruling Zabi family and the surviving Daikun faction, and to naively wait for the new Zeon state to collapse of its own accord. But that approach backfired, for it gave the Zabi family time to consolidate its grip on Side 3 and turn what had been a republic into a powerful dictatorship. Why did Side 3 turn into such a different system from what its founder, Zeon Zum Daikun, had envisioned? Top officials in the Earth Federation government were aghast and perplexed. But it was really the result of Girin Zabi and his skillful use of the Secret Service. Girin had his own maniacal vision of how mankind should evolve in space, and to realize it, he knew that simple autonomy for Side 3 would not be enough. He believed the Earth Federation government itself would have to be destroyed, despite the fact that doing so would require overcoming an enormous disadvantage in military and logistical strength. And to that end, he knew that he had to transform Side 3 into a military powerhouse, that he would need not a vacillating democracy or republican government, but a totalitarian system. Since his originally stated goal was to fulfill the vision of Zeon Zum Daikun, it was convenient to keep using Zeon Zum Daikun's name. Thus, the new state became the Principality of Zeon. Whether Degwin Zabi was aware of all his sons whether Degwin Zabi was aware of all of his son's machinations at the time was unclear, but Girin Zabi soon became supreme commander and managed to gain control of both the Zeon military and police, placing his brother Dozle and sister Caecilia in positions of power. In the few years since the founding of the Principality, he had finally come within sight of achieving all his immediate ambitions. If he regretted anything, it was that his younger brother, Sazro, had been assassinated in the early struggles with the Daikun faction, for Sazro would have been ideally suited to work in government administration. Inevitably, Girin began to contemplate mankind's longer-term future. He possessed a brilliant, highly analytical mind, and had an uncanny ability, even when grappling with particularly knotty problems, to think beyond it toward a larger goal. And having a larger goal always seemed to give him the power to break through whatever short-term problem he might confront. Oh boy. A familiar face is coming. Oh my goodness. I thought he wasn't in here. I forgot. In the middle of a book reading, Frag forgot the cast list. This wind, this feeling. 5 minutes after Admiral Chapman Jerome left his office, Girin began a meeting with another 2 officials, but then over his intercom speaker his secretary announced the arrival of Lieutenant Ramba Ral of the Secret Service. "Tell him I'll meet him next door," Girin replied into his desk mic. He stood up, excused himself, loosened the collar of his uniform, and headed for the smaller reception room that he always used for more intimate discussions. Ramba Ral was standing, waiting for him by the door. As Girin entered, he noted with satisfaction that his secretary, Cecilia Irene, had readied tea for both of them. "Good to see you again, Ramba. Have a seat."
"Thank you, Excellency,"
Ramba replied, bowing slightly and sitting by the table. He seemed unusually nervous.
"How about a shot?" Girin suggested.
"Don't mind if I do, sir,"
Ramba replied. As if on cue, Cecilia appeared with a little liquor cart, from which she produced a bottle of brandy and dispensed 1 shot into each teacup. Ramba immediately lifted his cup to his lips and began to sip, but he did it with enough grace that Girin was willing to overlook the violation of etiquette it represented. Girin was a finicky man who normally hated meetings that involved eating and drinking with his men. At banquets, there was always someone who rubbed him the wrong way with his boorish manners. That most of his guests were visibly nervous when eating with him bothered him even more. Slowly lowering his cup to the table, Ramba said,
"I've scanned all of Chalia Bull's reports up to yesterday. Frankly, sir, his writing isn't what one would expect from a man of his caliber. His observations seem extremely shallow."
Girin said, savoring the brandy flavor in his tea.
"When he's simply reporting facts, I think he's quite objective and accurate on even minor details. The only personal, subjective statement he makes is to lament the death, in action, of Lieutenant Junior Grade Kusko Al. As far as your sister Caecilia is concerned, he says he's only met her once, and makes no mention of his impression. In summary, I can only say that he produces very run-of-the-mill, superficial reports."
"Perhaps he wants to avoid speculation."
"That's probably correct, and would certainly be in character for him, but I must nonetheless confess I'm rather worried."
When Ramba Ral finished his sentence, he coughed softly and looked up at Girin. Noting Ramba's unusual demeanor, Girin decided to probe. "Lieutenant Chalia Bull always seemed an extremely cautious and conservative man, but I also trust your intuition, Ramba. You seem troubled. What is it?"
"Well, sir," Ramba began.
His entire body, including the manly mustache he sported, trembled slightly.
"It's about Commander Shar Aznable, sir. I've learned something that affects me personally, sir. He's one of the 2 orphan children of Zeon Zomdekun that my father, Jimba Ral, took with him when he fled to Earth years ago."
Supreme Commander Girin Zabi lowered his teacup to the tabletop and stared transfixed at Ramba. He had never dreamed of such a connection. Ramba Ral was an important official in the Secret Service, which he, Girin, directly controlled. He knew about Ramba's father, and precisely because he knew, he had been convinced when Ramba joined the service that he would never waver in his allegiance. And thus far, he had never been disappointed. Ramba was the type of military man he intuitively liked, broad-minded, devoted, and appropriately modest.
"You're seriously trying to tell me that our Commander Shar Aznable, the star of Zeon's MS forces, is really Kasval Rem Dekun?" he asked, heaving a sigh of exasperation.
"That's correct, sir," Ramba gingerly replied. "Apparently, after my father fled the principality, he bought the family name of Mass for the Dekun children and changed Kasval's name to Edward Mass. Then, in UC0070, Casval, aka Edward, managed to infiltrate back into Zeon and register himself under the Aznable family name. At age 18, he was accepted into the military academy and graduated at the top of his class. Because of an emergency call-up, he graduated 6 months ahead of schedule.
Any idea of his motive?
Not really, sir. It's awfully hard to get good intelligence from Earth, sir.
What about Jimba Rao, your father?
I've seen a report that he's still alive, sir.
Ramba Ral kept his head bowed slightly when he answered, as if unable to look Girin straight in the eye. Girin, for his part, was still reeling from the unexpected news, but at the same time he didn't want Ramba to take too much of the blame for this on himself. No matter what happened, he knew he could trust Ramba. He suddenly changed the subject. Well, what about Crowley? Have you both signed the papers yet? It was such an out-of-the-blue question that Ramba at first had no idea what his superior was talking about. You know, Crowley Haman. Your fiancé? It would be a better example to your men if you had an official marriage ceremony performed.
Sir,
The startled Ramba replied as his mind recovered.
she hasn't consented yet. She says she'll only consider if the war ends and I'm still alive.
I like that. A strong-willed girl. Well, her wish is about to be fulfilled, because we're about to settle this thing soon. Tell her I ordered you to get hitched. Tell her I ordered you to get hitched. I shouldn't get involved in matchmaking, but I did tell her I'd find her a good man.
Thank you, sir. I'll do everything I can to persuade her.
Ramba knew Girin was trying to make him feel more at ease, but he was unable to stop a sinking feeling of despair in his gut. Don't worry so much, Ramba, Girin added. I'll take care of Caecilia's Newtype Corps in my own fashion. Frankly, I agree with your opinion on Lieutenant Chaliabul. I think he might be a turncoat. His reports are far too superficial. He's not following my instructions.
Yes, sir,
Ramba replied in near whisper. If my sister has really put Casval Dakun in charge of her Newtype unit without knowing his true identity, it means I'll have to put my original plan into effect even earlier than I thought. Ramba said nothing. He had no way of knowing what Girin had ordered Admiral Chapman Jerome to do, but he could sense something big was going to happen, and Girin's next words seemed to confirm it. I told you we were about to settle this thing for once and for all, right? You and the Secret Service, Ramba, are going to become busy in the next few days. I hope you're ready. Ramba detected an odd twinkle in Girin's eye when he spoke. Don't worry about what happened with Casval Dakun, Girin continued. I'm going to create a whole new post-war order. Ramba watched Girin drain the last drops from his teacup. Then he suddenly understood. Girin had something up his sleeve, something so drastic that it could create a new world order and eliminate the problem with Casval Dakun at the same time. But he couldn't imagine what that something might be. We need to make sure you can have your wedding soon, Ramba, Girin said with a smile. There's just one more thing I want to know. Tell me what kind of man this Commander Shar Aznable really is. In response, Ramba proffered a voluminous file and said,
We've got several tapes on him. This is the result of our investigation, sir.
Girin glanced at the materials and marveled at Ramba's thoroughness. Thanks, he said. Good work. You're dismissed now, Lieutenant. Ramba saluted smartly and left the office. Girin pressed a special button in a little drawer underneath the table, and his secretary entered from the door to the left. Cecilia Irene was a buxom young woman dressed in a moss-green pantsuit outfit, the chic cut of which highlighted her long legs. Her long hair was brown, almost black, like her eyes. She had a heavy layer of lipstick on. I'm not very good at situations like this, Cecilia, Girin said. But, sir, Lieutenant Rambaral seems like a very forthright man, the kind who can be trusted. Girin nodded in agreement, and Cecilia smiled at him. Then she left the room. She was doing her job well. 2 years earlier, he had hired her specifically for her ability to size people up, and she hadn't disappointed him. But he wasn't about to let her observe him now. He flicked a switch on the intercom panel, deactivating the miniature observation camera built into it, and then pulled a video card from the file Lieutenant Ramba had left. It was a standard shirt pocket-sized card, with around 3 hours of images recorded on it. He plugged it in a slot, and then an image began moving on a wall monitor. The card appeared to be a copy of an amateur tape of Shar Aznable, and the images were of poor resolution. First, Giran saw a young couple walking down a path on the campus of the military academy. The man, apparently Shar, was blond, wearing sunglasses and walking arm in arm with a girl, laughing. The girl seemed to notice the camera first. Then the man walked directly over toward it, waving his hand and saying, "Hey, who gave you permission to film us?" Then a voice, apparently the cameraman, came from off-camera.
Heck, Lelouch asked me to.
The girl came closer, inquiring in an irritated tone.
Why are you always so uptight, Shar?
But the young man continued to confront the camera, threatening, "Stop it or else!" At that point, the screen went blank for several seconds, and then a different image appeared of a party at the academy. This time, the video seemed to have been shot by a professional. After a panoramic view of the dance floor, the camera zoomed in on one couple, showing a close-up of a man wearing regular, untinted glasses, his blond forelocks shaking above their frames in time to the music. It was Shar Aznable. He was an excellent dancer, and his partner was trying hard to keep up. To Giran's surprise, he suddenly noted a shadow-like scar on Shar's forehead, and wondered where it had come from. The dance sequence continued for several more minutes, and then switched to scenes of the graduation ceremony at the military academy. Giran saw himself presenting Garma Zabi, his own younger half-brother, with the special dagger given to the cadet with top graduating honors. The camera then moved to the next officer in line after Garma, to Shar Aznable, and lingered briefly on him. It was then that Giran remembered. Garma had not really been top in his class, but since he was a Zabi family member, the ceremony had been tailored so he would receive the dagger anyway. Humph, Giran thought. I should have given the dagger to Shar after all. If I had, I would have gotten a better look at him, and I might have recognized him as the son of Zeon Daikun just by his bearing. It's uncannily similar. After graduation, Shar had performed spectacularly in battle, and Giran had received steady reports of his promotions. Garma, for his part, had also always recommended Shar highly to him. It was just like Garma to have done so, Giran recalled. He had always seemed a little guilty over having stolen the graduating dagger from Shar. Such a baby, Giran thought, remembering the finely chiseled jaw of his half-sibling. The monitor next showed scenes of Shar Aznable as a lieutenant in the Principality of Zeon's military, wearing his distinctive face mask. According to one story Giran had heard, the mask had been specially allowed because Shar's eyes had been damaged when the automatic protective filter on his helmet had failed in battle. But while looking closely at the image on the screen, Garma realized... Whoops. It says Garma here, but they mean Giran. Giran realized the true reason Shar had taken to wearing the mask. He had infiltrated Zeon and begun wearing it to get nearer to the Zabi family, without being recognized as Kasval Daikun. It was the only plausible explanation for wearing something that covered half his face all the time. As an infant, Kasval had often played with both Giran and Kycilia Zabi, and Jim Baral had surely reminded him of it many times as he grew up. It was entirely conceivable that Jimba had in fact specifically raised Kasval, the son of Zeon Daikun, to infiltrate the principality one day, and destroy the Zabi family, and thus avenge his father's death. In fact, that was probably why Jim Baral had left the care of his own son, Ram Baral, with a foster parent, and defected to the Earth Federation with Zeon Daikun's 2 young children. He would have had no way of knowing how difficult this would eventually make life for his own son later, but he would simply raise Kasval to fulfill Zeon Zum Dakon's original goal, and once the lad was old enough, let him loose to perform his task. It had obviously been a long-term gamble, but Jim Baral was a crafty old fox, and probably knew Kasval would be toughened by challenges along the way, and turn into a seasoned warrior with a mission. As Girin all too well knew, it was Shar's internalized sense of mission off or on the battlefield that made him a real threat. He next thought. I could have sworn Kasval's sister was named Artesia, or something like that. He began poring through the other documents in the file that Rambaral had given him, searching for her name. Finally, he came across a reference to the fact that she had emigrated voluntarily to Side 7 and hoped to become a physician. There was nothing else on her, but that wasn't a problem. The problem was Kasval, and the fact that he clearly was becoming an increasingly formidable enemy. The more Girin thought about it, the more he realized that Kasval was slowly closing in on him, Girin Zabi. Kasval had made enormous progress toward his goal in a relatively short time, befriending Garma Zabi, graduating at the top of his class, and being steadily promoted in the ranks until he had won the confidence of Caecilia, without her ever learning of his true identity. If Caecilia had known, Girin was convinced If Caecilia had known, Girin was convinced, she never would have taken him under her wing. Now, the real question was whether Kasval Rem-Daikun, aka Shar Aznable, was really a true Newtype. Maybe Shar's use of the nickname Red Comet, Supreme Commander Girin Zabi thought, is less of a conceit than it seems. Suddenly, he imagined the vengeful spirit of Zeon Zum Daikun reincarnated in his young son. Chapter 18 Dozle Zabi. Being slapped by a girl didn't really hurt much, but the pain lingered a long time. Lieutenant Junior Grade Amaro Ray pondered this mystery briefly, and then fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. 5 hours later, he was jolted awake by an alarm. He thought about changing his underwear, but remembered he'd done so before hitting the sack. Perhaps, he speculated, he was unconsciously preparing for the possibility of death. He got up, dabbed some lotion on his curly, reddish hair, massaged it vigorously, and ran a brush across his head. Then he donned his dog tags, pulled on his trousers and jacket, and dashed out of his room. In the hallway, he grabbed the available first available lift grip. In the hallway, he grabbed the first available lift grip and let it pull him horizontally through the weightless air. When he reached the pilot's room, he found his comrades, Kai Shiden, Hayato Kobayashi, and Kriya Maja, already changing into their lemon-yellow combat suits.
Yo, Romeo, Kai joked. You owe me a dinner after the way you moved in on her, man.
Sorry, but you'll have to wait till this campaign's over, Amuro retorted. Then, turning to Hayato, he said, Next thing I know, you'll want one too. You bet, Hayato replied, and it'll cost you an arm and a leg. You stole our fave wave. Neither Hayato nor Kai knew that the woman they referred to, Petty Officer First Class Sayla Mass, had slapped Amuro earlier. They just knew he had slept with someone they both had designs on, and they were determined to extract a penalty from him. It was an unwritten rule among young men on Federation ships that the perpetrator of such a deed had to pay a penalty, either in the form of treating his comrades or forfeiting the right to visit the canteen for a month. There was a price to pay for being a Romeo. It was ironic, Amuro thought, because he had lost some of his physical interest in Sayla when she had told him that Shar Aznable, the faceless enemy he knew only from combat, was really her brother. He had been attracted to Sayla at first mainly because he knew she could give him something Lalah Sune couldn't. Something, it was safe to say, that was mainly physical love. And she hadn't disappointed him. In the process, they had established a relationship, but that had been more of an accident. But that had been more of an accident than anything else. They hadn't come together to become soulmates or to build a life together. He had sought something that he couldn't get from Lalah Sune. She had sought something her brother, Shar or Casval, couldn't give her. They had both sought substitutes for something else, and their love was therefore a simulated love, incapable of satisfying the true hunger in their souls. In the end, the spirits of both Shar and Lalah Sune had formed a barrier between them. When Sayla had told Amuro earlier that she wanted him to kill her brother if they met again in combat, she hadn't really meant it. She had been perversely motivated, not by hate, but by frustrated love for her brother. But Amuro had been unable to forgive her. He had tried not to let his feelings for Lalah Sune come between them, but she had not tried to do the same with her brother. She had naively assumed he would be able to understand her inner feelings, simply because he seemed to be a Newtype. As far as he was concerned, if it hadn't been for Shar Aznable, he wouldn't have had to kill Lalah Sune or even Kusko Al. That he had met them because of Shar was a thought too painful to contemplate. He placed enormous, almost naive weight on sincerity, and since he simply couldn't comprehend Sayla's statement, it remained between them like a festering wound. During his duel with Kusko Al's Elmeth, he had confronted Shar with Sayla's statement, hoping to throw him off balance and destroy him. Projecting his thoughts, "Shar, don't try to stop me!" He had added, "If you do, I'll have to kill you too, just as your sister asked." To his astonishment, it had worked. Shar had reflexively projected back, "Is it true?" clearly acknowledging receipt of his message and proving that sworn enemies, MS pilots, could communicate in the midst of combat. Partially out of spite, Amuro had replied, "It's not possible to lie on this level, Shar. If you don't believe me, ask your sister Artesia." The enemy red Rickdom had seemed to shudder, and then a scream, accompanied by a gush of rage, had reverberated through his cerebrum, astonishing him with its intensity. But by hesitating a few seconds for an answer in the heat of emotion, he had also given Shar an opportunity. The Rickdom had evaded him, and disappeared into the Corregidor Shoal Zone. He knew he had damaged it, but he also knew that in MS combat, anything short of a mortal blow was useless. He had hesitated, and he had lost Shar. Only another Newtype in the area could possibly have understood what had transpired between them. Now, in the pilot's room on the Pegasus II, as Amuro zipped shut the triple layer of fasteners connecting his helmet to his jacket, he bitterly regretted not having killed Shar when he had had the chance. He felt he had failed as a military pilot, and as an only child he also felt a weird jealousy over the intensity of Sayla's relationship with her brother. And that had perversely propelled him to tell her about the interchange. He knew now that he never should have mentioned it. She had tried hard in her own way to apologize after making her impetuous, crazy request about killing Shar. She had tried hard to bridge the distance her words had created between them. And he had ignored her efforts. When she had slapped him after he told her what happened, he had known why. He rotated a knob on the left ear of his helmet and lowered his sun visor. He wondered if he were rushing too much, but he was still the last one out of the pilot's room. On the wide-range helmet receiver, he immediately heard the chatter going on between both Kai and Hayato, and, mixed in with it, Sayla Mass's voice. Pretty, blonde Sayla. Her voice was practically inside his head. He tried mouthing the words, "Sayla, I love you," and was amazed at how beautiful they sounded. Half the engines in the Madagascar, the flagship of Commander Shar Aznabil's newly formed 300th Autonomous Squadron, had been disabled from damage received in the fight with Amaro Ray's unit. Shar had been out in space at the time in his Rickdom, but it had been his judgment call, rather than that of Lieutenant Commander Bruce Marshall, the captain of the ship, that had saved it from total destruction. As soon as Shar had witnessed the Gundam destroy Kusko Al's Elmeth, he had ordered all survivors in his unit to retreat. With Lieutenant Chalia Bull bravely supporting him, he had engaged the Gundam suit once more in order to gain time, and it had retreated of its own accord, clearly fearing a pincer attack. Then, after shepherding 3 surviving but heavily damaged Gatl fighter bombers to safety, he and Chalia had finally returned to the Madagascar. The 300th had then withdrawn from the area, using the Corregidor shoals as a screen. With the Gatl fighter bombers effectively out of action, its only remaining viable forces were 4 surviving Rickdoms. Just lost the page, I'm sorry. There we go. In the pilot's room on the Madagascar, student recruit Lieutenant Junior Grade Leroy Gilliam hung a coffee tube on the holder next to him, turned to Shar and Chalia, and choked, I can't believe I survived and Crumble died. There's a reason you're alive, Leroy, Shar said, trying to console him. You got 2 gold stars for sinking 2 enemy battleships before, right? And you're young. It's an advantage. Shar removed his helmet as he spoke, and it temporarily muffled his voice. As an astonished Chalia Bull watched, Shar also proceeded to remove the face mask he always wore. He had a far more gentle expression beneath it than Chalia had ever imagined. It was odd. Shar had a pessimistic side to him, but he also had an ability to think beyond the immediate present to the future. Most such people Chalia had known had an almost piercing expression, a look of excessive cleverness. It was true of Giran and Dozle Zabi, and it had even been true of Kusko Al. But Shar was different. He radiated youthful energy and had the aura of a genuinely refined individual. Perhaps, Chalia thought, it was from his upbringing, but that should have been more than cancelled out by the years of hardship in the military. Even Leroy was astounded. Shar seemed far too youthful and too dignified at the same time. As if suddenly aware of the reaction he had created, Shar turned and grinned. Don't tell me this is the first time I ever took my mask off in front of you, he said. If it is, don't let it bother you. I never take this thing off in public, not even in front of the Supreme Commander. But there's no point in hiding anything from you men anymore. Leroy felt a thrill when he heard Shar's words. He had long ago overcome any resistance to having such a young leader, and now he felt genuine respect and trust. Shar had an almost princely quality to him. He and his comrades had often discussed Newtypes among themselves, and they had unanimously recognized Kusko Al as someone with Newtype pilot skills, but Shar, they often felt, was the more evolved as a Newtype human. The problem, of course, was that no one had really defined a true Newtype yet. Was it someone who simply had extrasensory perception? Or was it someone who might help transform the human race? If the latter, as the late Zeon Zum-Daikun had seemed to indicate in his speeches, then Kusko Al's paranormal abilities were clearly too predominant, and she was not well-rounded enough as a human. The MS pilots had therefore secretly pinned their hopes on Shar. Most people, Leroy knew, were ordinary. And if the true Newtype concept could apply to ordinary people, then Newtype characteristics should also manifest themselves in a very ordinary way. Before joining the 300th Autonomous, he himself had been tested and identified as someone with Newtype powers, but he certainly didn't think of himself as an Esper or a paranormal or anything like that. Before the war, he had excelled in gymnastics, and for the last 5 years he had worked out just to stay fit. He had also wanted to become a painter, and he was proud of the fact that his artistic ability was above average. He liked to think, in fact, that he had the emotional sensitivity of an artist and the detached, objective makeup of a philosopher. But that was all. Then, when he saw his commander's uncovered face, he believed he finally understood. Ordinary people can be new types. Ultimately, his opinion was based on the reaction of one normal person to another. He might have felt differently if Char's hair had been a little less blonde, or if the scar on his brow had extended more toward the bridge of his nose. But he was a budding artist who secretly idolized Michelangelo, and when he looked at Char, except for a slightly more average, less imposing physique, he noted a resemblance to Michelangelo's statue of David. It was a subjective opinion, but one that clinched the issue for him. Char's uncovered face and aura of nobility finally convinced him that he was in the presence of a true new type. The tiny briefing room on the Madagascar, once filled with MS pilots, now held only 3. The space seemed enormous and cold. "I've ordered the captain to rejoin the Swammel," Char commented, referring to Dozle Zabi's flagship as he sipped from a coffee tube. "Does that mean we're retreating, sir?" Leroy asked. "How can we possibly go forward?" Char quickly fired back. "Where would we go, anyway?" He knew Leroy was cursing himself for asking such a dumb question, but he deliberately refrained from being too hard on him. "Listen, Lieutenant," he said with a smile, "I'm all in favor of a better idea if you have one. Let me know if you do, okay?" "No, sir," Leroy answered. "You're absolutely right. We should link up with Her Excellency Kycilia and then decide what our next move will be. The way we have our forces deployed under Operation Revol, Operation Revol 1 should make it difficult for the Federation to attack us." "What makes you say that?" "Because we're pretty evenly matched in terms of local strength, and because Revol seems to be severely underestimating Excellency Dozle Zabi's true power." "But Revel's the type who'd do a structural analysis of a bridge before crossing it. What makes you think he's underestimating anything?" "Well, you're right, sir, but he seems too preoccupied with our system project, obsessed with its being some sort of secret weapon. I think he's rushing to try and destroy Abo Aku as a result." "I know you're speculating, Lieutenant, but I think your logic's a little weak." "Of course it is, sir, but there's something else to consider. It's true the Federation Mobile Suit unit has been running all over us, but even if the Gundam Model MS were specifically created for a Newtype pilot, and even if it were equipped with something like the Elmeth Psychomu interface, it still wouldn't be enough to tip the balance of power in this war. And that's true on our side, too. Throughout military history, I don't think a single superweapon has ever been enough to end an entire war. I also don't think a single individual with paranormal powers has ever done anything spectacular enough to go down in history before. History isn't decided by solitary individuals anyway, but by a horde of them. So unless one strikes at the core of the problem." "The core of the problem, eh? So how does that apply to the Earth Federation?" "Well, sir, the Jabro command post on Earth's already an empty shell. It's not even worth trying to annihilate. I'm not even sure the problem's just the Federation." Char said nothing. He put down his coffee tube, stood up, and stared at the dozen or more intercom monitors on the wall of the room, his back to the other 2 men. Leroy watched him, then turned and glanced at Chalia Bull, whispering, "Think the commander's going to tell us what to do?" Chalia laughed gruffly and said, "Huh, maybe, but don't hold your breath. The situation's too complex to predict the outcome yet. We don't have enough time, and we don't have enough people on our side either." Char heard Chalia's words behind him, imagined a smug look on the man's face, and felt mild disgust. There was no way Chalia could have known unless he were a paranormal freak, but when he had said that he was looking for a better idea, he actually had also been thinking about the earlier interchange between himself and the Gundam pilot and about his sister Artesia. He was more sensitive than he had originally thought. In fact, during his last battle with the Gundam, if he hadn't experienced a burst of sensation in the midst of all the killing, his consciousness and that of the Gundam MS pilot would never have linked, and their communication would never have been possible. From what the upstart young Gundam pilot had conveyed to him during their confrontation, it was clear that he knew Sayla Mass was really Artesia Som Daikun, a secret only Jim Baral, who had raised the Daikun children, was supposed to know. And there was only one way the Gundam pilot could have known, and that was if he were close to, or involved with, Artesia. Bitterly, he remembered how the Gundam pilot had destroyed both Lalah Sune and Kusko Al. At least his sister hadn't fallen for a wimp. He turned and looked at the two men behind him. "You're probably wishing someone like the Gundam pilot was on our side," he said, "but he's not." "Well, he would have made a nice addition to our team," an unfazed Chalia replied, "assuming he didn't hate the Principality too much. "No, I don't detect that in him," Char said. "Do you think maybe he's a real Newtype, sir?" Leroy asked tentatively. "Probably," Char answered, "at least in the sense that Zeon Zum Daikun once referred to. I think he's probably a harbinger of true Newtypes." "A harbinger," Leroy said. "I like the sound of that word, Commander. The world was changed by the Renaissance of ancient Europe. With new types, maybe mankind's about to experience another Renaissance." "Who knows?" Char replied coolly. "Words like Renaissance or Enlightenment are just abstractions coined by historians, aren't they? Who knows what the people of the time really thought? The point is, not to get too carried away." "But, sir," Leroy protested, "the ancient artists and philosophers were surely aware of what they were doing. Think of Dante, Da Vinci, and even Raphael." "Sorry to disappoint you," Char answered curtly, "but I've never even heard of them. And I'm not certain how evolved we can claim to be ourselves at this point in time." I see," Leroy replied almost wistfully. He had left out Michelangelo's name, but it was probably a good thing. If his superior had said he had never heard of him either, he would have been crushed. Chalia quietly spoke up. "I think we've touched on something important here. We need to change the status quo. We need to change the whole system of doing things." One of the wall monitors suddenly flickered to life, showing the captain of the Madagascar making a report. Fighting had broken out again in the region through which they were retreating. Char turned to Chalia and Leroy. "Just between you, me, and the stars," he said with a wink, "we will." Vice Admiral Dozle Zabi's assignment suited his character. He was in command of the Principality of Zeon's mobile assault force. Dozle had a personality utterly different from that of his half-brother, Supreme Commander Giran Zabi, and he was often described as both manly and coarse. He had the physique of a born soldier, but as his closest confidants knew, he had a complex about his appearance, and feared it was too intimidating. Perhaps in reaction, he was extremely kind and gentle to his wife and children, and to his troops. He was famous for always recommending his men to Giran for promotion, usually with some sympathetic remark about their difficult family situation. Those who knew his true nature were intensely loyal, and would follow him anywhere. Right now, however, the normally calm Dozle was furious. General Revel, leading the Earth Federation Armada, appeared to be ignoring Solomon, where Dozle and his forces were based.
"I don't know what the man's got up his sleeve," Dozle grumbled, "but he grates on my nerves. He doesn't seem to think we're worthy opponents."
Until 12 hours earlier, Dozle had planned to keep most of his ships in close to Solomon for its defense. But now, because Revel appeared to be concentrating his attack on Abo Aku, he had decided to take a gamble and move his forces out, even if it left Solomon exposed. Dozle was a true warrior, the kind of man who liked to be where the action was. He had once personally piloted a Zaku MS to the front during the Battle of Loom, ostensibly to observe the situation firsthand, but actually to engage in combat. His aides had panicked and even sent out 3 squads of suits to guard him. Giran Zabi had laughed when he heard about his younger brother's exploits and reproached him for his foolishness, but Dozle's bravery had only won him greater respect from his men. They were convinced that even if Dozle was an admiral and a Zabi family member, he was with them all the way. They would have followed him into hell. Dozle had even commissioned the development of a new model mobile suit-like machine for himself. Currently undergoing field and flight tests, the Big Zam, as it was called, was heavily armored and, because it had legs but no arms, only vaguely humanoid. If mobile suits often resembled giant infantry soldiers, the Big Zam looked more like a tank. It was many times larger, and with 16 megaparticle cannons deployed around the periphery of its fuselage, which looked like 2 soup bowls welded together, it was capable of blasting anything in a 360-degree radius. Because Zeon engineers had succeeded in developing a particle accelerator mechanism of unprecedented compactness, the cannons had virtually no barrels, and thus had difficulty covering the area immediately above and below the Big Zam's fuselage, but that was more than compensated by the machine's fundamental agility. Like mobile suits, the Big Zam was not yet perfect. Before most suits were formally deployed, they underwent rigorous prototype and field tests to identify and solve potential problems. But after 2 years of operation, they still needed many improvements. Engineers were desperately trying to make them more compact, give them more power, and find a way to enhance their performance in formation. The Big Zam, however, was a product of Dozle Zabi's character and the Zeon military organization. Whatever his scientists and engineers came up with, he wanted to try out himself. If something didn't work, he would demand a modification. And in pushing the Big Zam to its technical limits, he and his engineers were following in the tradition established by their brilliant Nazi German counterparts in another age. In totalitarian political systems, where nearly everything was decided according to the whim of a leader, individual initiative was often crushed. But under the wing of the military in the same system, science and technology often flourished, even if the individual engineers and scientists involved originally had utterly different agendas and goals. As history had shown, if the possibility of technological progress existed, regardless of its application, few scientists were capable of resisting a summons to work by their political leaders. In the beginning, Principality scientists made excuses for their cooperation with the military, extolling the benefits of spin-offs to the civilian sector and emphasizing that the technologies they were developing were morally neutral and could be used for peaceful purposes as well as for war. But when war actually came, they fervently sought to ensure their nation's victory and gave their all to developing pure weapons of destruction. Vice Admiral Dozle Zabi took off in his flagship, the Gandao, with the Big Zam in tow. His total force, divided into 3 battle groups, consisted of over 100 ships. Fortunately for Dozle, the battle group clustered around the Dolos-class carrier Midro, normally assigned to the defense of Solomon, arrived at its staging point late, and was therefore able to strike a wing of the Federation armada. In a one-sided battle, 50 combat-seasoned Zakus, accompanied by Jiko attack ships and Gatl fighter bombers from the Midro group, easily annihilated over 20 Federation ships. The Zeon pilots had boasted prior to the battle that the Federation Flying Manta fighter bombers would be no match for them, and they were proven correct. Dozle himself had no such luck with the 127th Autonomous. Several hours after leaving the Corregidor Shoals, the 127th had linked up with the 203rd and the 165th, and, with them, was approaching Abo Aku from above. Both the 203rd and 165th each consisted of a battleship and 5 cruisers, heavy and light, while the 127th included the Pegasus II and the Cyprus. Dozle's group consisted of the Gandao, accompanied by 8 heavy and light cruisers and a guard of 30 Zakus. Up against 30 Zakus, the Federation group's 20 Mr. Ball machines and 10 gym suits were clearly outclassed. The Balls were an early, rudimentary version of mobile armor, and toy-like compared to Zaku's. The Gyms were mass-produced mobile suits, but they were really an interim model manufactured while the Gundam and gun cannons were still in prototype phase, and hardly of a finalized design. On paper, they had specs comparable to Zaku's, but in actual performance they were outclassed because Zeon pilots were far more experienced. The Federation group's ace in the hole was Amuro's little unit, consisting of junior-grade Lieutenants Kriya Maja in his Gym 325, Hayato Kobayashi in his C-109 gun cannon, Kai Shiden in his C-108 gun cannon, and Amuro Ray in his G-3 Gundam. It was immediately clear that Amuro's unit was more than capable of holding its own against the Zeon force. It had, in fact, begun to demonstrate an astoundingly high level of performance. Normal suits were lightweight spacesuits, independently functioning life support systems, pressurized and temperature controlled, and no matter how well made, they would always be an awkward fit. Pilot suits were far easier to wear. They used a high-grade, 5-layer woven blend of glass fiber and flexible plastic, and were worn close to the skin. They had roughly the same fit as the pressurized suits once worn by fighter pilots on Earth. To Amuro, even his pilot suit seemed to interfere with his reflexes. He had never thought of himself as being particularly well coordinated, but during training he had demonstrated better than average ability, and in combat his strengths had been mysteriously amplified. And the more he improved, the more the pilot suit seemed to get in his way. It irritated him. He wished he could operate the MS naked. And if only his skin could withstand absolute zero temperatures, and if only he didn't need to breathe, he would have loved to get rid of the MS altogether. Then, he fantasized in a moment of overconfidence, he would easily be able to detect all the alien forces in the battlefield of space before him. The next instant, his left monitor showed a Zaku coming toward him. He put the Gundam into a sharp turn and fired a blast from his beam rifle. It was his third Zaku in the battle. Kai and Hayato, riding in their gun cannons 50 kilometers out on either side, were doing a good job of driving the enemy suits straight toward him, and Kriya, holding the rear in his Gym, was giving him the room he needed to fire. His little unit, he proudly realized, had already evolved into a highly effective fighting team. Then he heard Hayato yell at him again from his port side. Beams of light streaked through the blackness, and through them an enemy Zaku with a squad leader's antenna-like insignia swooped toward him. It was the fourth Zaku. Amuro fired and scored a hit. He was dazzled for a second by the explosion that followed, and another Zaku took advantage of it to slip into his blind spot. He panicked, pulled his beam rifle trigger too fast, and missed. The Zaku veered sharply to the right, spinning in Kai's direction, but seconds later was enveloped in blasts from the gun cannon's shoulder guns and exploded in a ball of light. Working as a team, Amuro and his 3 comrades had already bagged 7 enemy Zakus, an unprecedented number of continuous kills. To Amuro's profound embarrassment, his preoccupation with his pilot suit and his overconfidence had allowed a Zaku to blindside him. Worse yet, the Zaku pilot had been a young hotshot, and clearly not a seasoned veteran. Amuro's situation resembled that of the ancient samurai swordsman he had once read about. When two samurai of relatively equal standing faced off, they were often able to divine a certain logic to each other's moves and adopt an appropriate counter-strategy. But this became exceedingly difficult if one of the warriors was extremely skilled, as a true master rarely revealed any pattern to his opponent. Normally, however, with practice, there were ways of dealing with even the most unpredictable opponent. The biggest threat to the expert swordsman was an opponent who had already mentally resigned himself to death and was attacking in a suicidal rage. Then it was usually better to avoid a frontal attack, avoid seeking an immediate kill, and instead work to weaken and isolate the opponent first. Amuro knew he was no samurai. He was riding in a 16-meter-tall Gundam mobile suit. But his situation resembled that of the samurai in that his enemies could conceivably plunge out of the blackness toward him from any direction, at random. He knew that if only he could put his mind into a zen-like state of nothingness, he would be able to detect the presence of an approaching enemy. His real enemy now was overconfidence, not his pilot suit. It was functioning as designed, protecting his physical body. And whatever irritation he felt was shared by the Zeon pilots. The moment he finally regained his mental equilibrium, he detected an enemy presence. "This is the gift," he thought, exulting in his good fortune. "The gift of Newtypes." He thanked the stars that his powers of insight and intuition seemed to be increasing, for he knew that true victory wouldn't be achieved by merely eliminating a few Zakus in the battle zone. True victory, military theory went, could only be obtained by destroying the enemy fleet flagship, in this case Dozle Zabi's Gandao. And Amuro knew it was located somewhere 30 degrees below and to his left. It was one thing to understand the theory. It was another to try to put it into action and identify the true center of the enemy's strength. He was operating in the real world of space, not the world of fantasy films and holoscopes. Pilots had to visually identify the enemy, but against a background of black space with its millions of burning stars, visually sighting and identifying an object over 100 kilometers away was no mean feat. It was especially hard to distinguish between enemy and friendly ships. Harder than in a confused dogfight on Earth. Harder, some old-timers said, than locating a single grain of sand on a long beach. Amuro nonetheless intuitively detected a force capable of controlling the entire combat zone. What is it? He immediately wondered. It was more powerful than anything he had ever encountered, so strong that it flowed through the Gundam's armor as a heavy, insistent, undulating wave. He shifted his Gundam onto a slightly lower vector and turned on his laser oscillator for a few milliseconds, signaling in a burst to his left, right, and rear, trying to tell Kai, Hayato, and Kriya to follow him. In a diamond formation separated by 20 kilometers, the four suits then dropped toward the sun. And along the way they took out 2 more Zakus and a Musai-class Zeon Cosmo cruiser. Vice Admiral Dozle Zabi donned his pilot suit and strapped himself into the captain's seat in the Big Zam's cockpit. The machine's nuclear fusion engine fired with a pleasing sound.
"What's the delay?" he demanded of the pilot and co-pilot seated in front of him. "Let's get those Federation suits."
There's something odd about them, sir, one pilot replied. 2 or 3 are streaking toward the Gandao right now, just like the Red Comet does.
"Don't mention Shar to me now!" Dozle barked, infuriated, as he donned his helmet.
Red Comet, Shar Aznamoul's nickname, was the last thing he wanted to hear. He had cashiered Shar earlier for failing to protect his younger brother, Garma, in battle, and afterward his sister, Kaisilia Zabi, for some weird reason, had reinstated him in her unit. Now, the mention of Shar's nickname only served to remind Dozle of the irritating fact that he had dismissed Shar too soon. It felt like a personal criticism.
Tell the Gandao we don't need an escort, Dozle barked. We'll destroy the entire Federation MS unit with this Big Zam. Cut this machine loose.
Dozle was getting more and more emotional and reacting more and more impetuously. The Gandao released the Big Zam's tow line as commanded. With 3 rocket nozzles in its underbelly belching flame, the machine leapt into space, accelerating as fast as a heavy cruiser under full power as it climbed to meet the approaching enemy MS unit.
I don't care if we are being attacked by some prissy Newtype unit,
An enraged Dozle shouted.
McLaughlin's group and the Midrow should be smashing through the Federation line from the rear right now. If this Federation unit thinks it can run over us the way they have the others, well, let 'em try.
Dozle had every right to be angry. His Gandao-led fleet from Solomon represented the cream of the Principality's mobile forces in the area, but in the last 20 minutes, a tiny force of enemy suits had been wreaking havoc with his plans, destroying half the forces thrown at them, cutting a swath like a scythe through a field of grain. Even worse, they were aiming straight for his own flagship, the Gandao. The more he thought about it, the more humiliated he felt, for he knew that if it weren't for the unit harassing him now, he could easily be smashing a hole in the entire Federation line.
I don't believe this Newtype crap for a second, Dozle exclaimed. Designing humans to function like machines in battle. Ha! Crank up the fear quotient, and at some point even the best human pilot will pee in his pilot suit. That's a lot of alliteration.
1 o'clock, sir,
The Big Zam pilot yelled.
Up 11 degrees.
As Dozle watched, an image flickered 2 or 3 times across an upper right monitor and then stabilized. It showed a telephoto view of a light gray mobile suit.
What happened to the white suit I've heard so much about? Dozle demanded. Is that it?
Yes, sir.
The Big Zam pilot yelled back, his voice trembling.
Looks like they've tried to camouflage it, sir.
He was fast approaching the psychological state his commander had referred to. But he would never notice unless he survived and later checked the urine flask he was hooked up to. Dozle kept yelling.
It can't possibly have more than 1 beam cannon, and that means we've got over 10 times more firepower than it does. Get him in our sights. Hurry!
There are 4 enemy suits.
The Big Zam pilot screamed. In response, 4 beam cannons on the Big Zam's prow fired for several milliseconds, and the effect was like a curtain of light, for each cannon could be moved incrementally to create a diffused strafing effect. As they watched, the Federation suits all swooped as if avoiding the blasts, and then reformed again, heading straight not for the Gandao, but for the Big Zam.
4 suits?
Dozle shouted in disbelief. He could scarcely believe his eyes. The entire Federation MS unit was now bearing down on him. He felt the flesh on his back crawl in cold fear. He could understand how the enemy, out of sheer luck, could evade a beam blast, but he could not understand how, at nearly the same instant, they could have corrected course to attack him. He was no fool. He was battle-seasoned enough to know intuitively that this was no ordinary enemy. It was one with a terrifying resolve.
Put up a barrage of defensive fire, he commanded, shouting. Initiate evasive action. Let me operate one of those cannons.
He grabbed the controls of a cannon in front of him, activated its sights, and saw a simulated model of the enemy approaching on the screen. Generated from data provided by laser sensors, at close range the model was fairly accurate. He got the lead enemy suit in his sights, put his fingers on the trigger, and fired 3 times. And the suit somehow evaded each blast. Another chill ran down his spine. With renewed horror, he knew his earlier hunch had been correct. There was no way to explain logically how the enemy could have possibly avoided his carefully aimed shots. For a second, he wondered if the computer-generated sights on his display had been skewed, but he knew their electronics were so simple that it was out of the question. Dozle yelled to no one in particular.
Does this mean they're operating the same way people say Shar Aznable does?
In an attempt to evade the attacking suits and to rise above them, he made the Big Zam accelerate in a full-power climb. 6 Gs forced the men back into their seats, but Dozle nonetheless managed to recheck the cockpit monitors to see how the enemy formation reacted. Again, the images were a simulation, a computer-generated extrapolation of data received from sensors over a 10-second period. But they were better than nothing, and at least gave an indication of the enemy's relative size and mass, and the speed of its approach.
The suit-riding tail in the formation seems a little slower than the others,
he mused aloud. Knowing he was rising above the enemy somehow made him feel better. In a weightless environment, words like above and below were technically meaningless, but humans still adhered to spatial concepts relative to their own physical position. And in that context, being on top of an enemy meant a great deal. Unfortunately for Dozle, however, it was a two-way street. On Amuro Ray's cockpit monitors, the Big Zam appeared to be climbing up toward him from below. He knew he couldn't count on his men hearing him clearly, but he radioed his observations anyway. "Some sort of new suit's coming at us fast. It's not a Zaku, it's not skirted, and it's not an Elmeth. Now, I've never seen this thing before." Normally, making a radio call would have distracted him momentarily, but this time it didn't. He sensed another 3 beam blasts directed at him, evaded them in the nick of time, and continued plunging toward the enemy machine, restraining his fire until he was in effective range for his beam rifle. Kai and Hayato, on either side of him, seemed to be doing the same, but the twin shoulder guns on both of their gun cannons erupted in flame. Explosions occurred near the enemy machine, indicating a near miss. Amuro suddenly knew that he had to act fast. For some mysterious reason, the force that he had sensed controlling the battle zone no longer emanated from the nearby Principality battleship, but from the machine charging straight toward him. He swung his beam rifle scope in front of him, lined up the sights with the legs of the approaching enemy, and fired. A band of light leapt from the barrel of his gun. In the cockpit of the Big Zam, Dozle gasped in astonishment. The pilot and co-pilot groaned in fear and did the only thing they could think of, which was to keep the Big Zam steady on course. They knew no Zeon MS pilot could have sniped at them with such precision on the first shot, not even the Red Comet.
Dozle screamed, "Roll this bird over! Ignite reverse thrusters!"
The pilot obeyed, and an intense G-force bore down on them, riveting them to their seats and nearly snapping their collarbones. They felt the blood drain from their heads, but there was no time to become dizzy. A second enemy blast creased the prow of the Big Zam, and some of the particles on its periphery hit home, for along with an odd whoosh sound that seemed to emanate outside their helmets, they felt an intense pressure. Instinctively, out of terror more than anything else, they began madly strafing the enemy formation.
"Knock those bastards out of the sky!"
Dozle yelled, at the same time saying a silent prayer of thanks for the pressurization in his pilot suit. He was remarkably fit, but he knew the suit had kept him from losing consciousness. The beam blast from Kriya Maja's Jim 325 created a burst of light with an unusually evanescent quality when it hit the enemy machine. Amuro knew it wasn't a fatal blow, but he was grateful that Kriya was on his team and not on the enemy's. "Nice follow-up, Kriya!" he barked into his mic. He was impressed. Kriya had waited until Amuro had fired before initiating his own attack, just as he was supposed to. Kriya had qualified at the same time as he had, but Jim's were a mass-produced Gundam type of suit that had only recently been put into active service. He had joined the 127th only after the battle inside Texas, and therefore had relatively little MS combat experience, but he was learning fast. He could already evaluate a combat situation instantly, and, while supporting Amuro's Gundam, calmly carry out his assigned tasks. The Zeon machine responded with wild beam blasts of greater and greater intensity. Amuro knew that it was time. He altered the Gundam's course vector 150 degrees to one that would take him under the enemy machine, all the while keeping his attention on the Zeon battleship in the area approaching from his left. He checked the sights on his beam rifle and fired first 1, then 5 blasts. He saw the flash of a direct hit and exulted in the possibility of having destroyed the weird two-legged machine in front of him. And then he let out a curse. Damn! Kriya's Jim, which had maneuvered to his left side, suddenly exploded in a ball of light. Amuro couldn't tell if the fire had come from the odd Zeon machine or the battleship. The computer in his suit merely indicated in bright, dispassionate yellow on his upper left monitor that a friendly suit had been destroyed. Kriya's last words, barely audible through the static, were, "The bastards!" Using the light from Kriya's explosion, the two gun cannons turned toward the Zeon battleship. Amuro instinctively knew his comrades were telling him to concentrate on the two-legged machine, and he immediately scanned for it. In the light, he soon spotted it again, minus a left leg. Sparks were intermittently flying from the severed stump like blood spurting from a fresh wound, but the main engine still seemed to be intact, and it was closing in on him nearly as fast as Azaku. He wasn't sure if he should aim for the engine or what he thought was the cockpit, for he had never seen any mobile armor like it before. And while he deliberated, the machine fired a cannon on its left side. In an instant, the Gundam's shield melted, and its left arm was scorched by particles on the beam's periphery. Luckily, he had been able to make his MS leap upward, this time positioning himself above the enemy. "Your time has come!" he screamed as he fired. A particle beam blasted a hole in the top of the machine, hitting what he thought must be the main engine. The fuselage shook and slowly tilted, but did not explode. Suddenly, he felt uneasy. What had happened? Hadn't his beam blast been powerful enough to pierce the machine? He sighted again, shifting his aim to the area where he assumed the cockpit should be. And then he saw such a bizarre sight that his trigger finger froze in terror. As he watched, paralyzed, a mysterious black mist suddenly roiled forth from the fuselage cockpit without diffusing completely into the vacuum of space. The mist seemed to be reaching out, trying to ensnare him. He instinctively knew he mustn't let it reach him, and tried to maneuver the Gundam out of the area, but, cursing, discovered that his own coordination seemed to have been affected. Luckily, the Gundam began a smooth retreat anyway. For a moment, he wondered if he were confronting some sort of supernatural apparition. Theoretically, gases were not supposed to be able to retain their shape so well in space. Perhaps, he tried to reassure himself, what he had witnessed had simply been unusual smoke from an explosion in the fuselage. He desperately wanted to believe his own theory, but seconds later, when the mist reformed in front of him again, his theory collapsed. For a few seconds he felt as though he were looking at what the old people had called ghosts. Two eyes seemed to be staring out from the misty black form at the Gundam, at him. Perhaps they were background stars peeping through the mist, but for a second it was real. He shuddered and wondered if he were hallucinating. The eyes seemed filled with hate. What in heaven's name was happening? He was just an MS pilot, and this was beyond the scope of his imagination. The next instant he sensed a rapid sequence of pings, as if bullets from a machine gun or a rifle were striking the Gundam fuselage. Even his headset picked up the noise. He stared at the top of the enemy machine directly below him. It was still belching the strange mist and was so close that he could visually make out what looked like a normal suited figure, standing erect on the upper deck, firing away. with a rifle, of all things. The bullets were bouncing off the Gundam's armor. It was an odd, almost comical scene. The man was tiny in relation to the machines, and there was no way in the world he could destroy a Gundam mobile suit with a rifle. But there he was, slapping in a new magazine and continuing to fire away brazenly. Then Amuro finally knew. The mysterious force he had been sensing in the area belonged to this figure. Anger began to well up inside him. It was this man, he realized, who had been the source of the frightening black mist he had seen. The man was frantic. The man was a fanatic. I know how to read. The man was a fanatic. These people are the cause of the war! Amuro raged aloud. Vice Admiral Dozle Zabi screamed in protest. A single mobile suit can't determine an entire battle! Then, as an image of his wife, Zena, and infant daughter, Minerva, flashed through his mind, a blast from the Gundam's beam rifle vaporized both him and the Big Zam. And that is the end of those 2 chapters. We will call it good for now. Come on. Let me try and find a next decent breaking off point. Oh my god, that chapter is long. Jeez Louise. Good golly. Excuse me. All right, with that, I got to go. Thanks to everyone who tuned in or is tuning in after the fact. If you're tuning in after the fact, I do these live, which explains a lot about how rough they are. These are not really edited much, and they're not edited at all, let's be honest. And they're done live, spur of the moment. I stream live at noon Eastern Standard Time, or East Coast US time, starting at about noon. I just said that. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. There we go. So if you want to catch me live, you can. If you don't want to catch me live and just want to watch these after the fact, totally okay. I don't really care. It's fine either way. People are watching them and enjoying them. That's what I care about. That's awesome. That's what I like. I'm just so eager to please. Even if nobody but me likes it, I'm still going to keep doing it, though, because it's a hobby and I find it entertaining. Anyway, that is the next chunklet. That is the start of the 3rd volume of, 3rd book of the Mobile Suit Gundam Novelization, entitled Confrontation. There's going to be a bunch of confrontation in this. We're also going to learn more about Gihren Zabi and how he acts behind the scenes. And, well, things are going to be pretty climactic in general. If only Zeon had mass-produced the Big Zam, they might have won. Right? The Big Zam in this, they don't really make a big deal out of it having an eye field barrier, which is supposed to be a barrier that prevents beam weapons from damaging whatever's within them. I don't know if the novelization version of the Big Zam has an eye field barrier. They make a reference to weird lights or weird shimmers from beam rifle shots, and Amuro dumps a lot of ammo at the thing and doesn't do much damage until way late in the confrontation. So maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It happens very quickly. it's there and then it's gone. Sadly. As a Big Zam fan. More Big Zam is better Big Zam. But that's okay. Oh, don't tell me that. Don't tell me that I died for... Did you lose internet or did I lose internet? Because it doesn't look like mine froze. Ah! That's bad. I don't want to have to re-record, but I'll do it if I have to. Anyway, thank you for telling me. I'll have to skim through it and see if it died. On my end, it doesn't look like it did, but I'll double check the file afterwards. I do have to go back through my playlists that I fiddled with over the weekend because I think some stuff got put into the wrong order, but that's fine. I'll deal with that. That happens a lot. Oh, it was you. Oh, thank goodness. I'll still go and double check mine just in case. Anyway, I got a scooch. I got taxes, taxes to do. So I'm gonna bang those out. I want to get that done this week if I can. Yeah. This Wednesday we'll be doing the second half of the Cory Doctorow short story called Radicalized, the titular story of the Radicalized short story collection. And then on Friday, we'll be continuing to read through the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons. So look forward to all those. I honestly haven't planned too much what I'm going to do in specific after I finish this book and Radicalized, or the Mobile Suit Gundam Novelization and Radicalized. I haven't gotten that far. I've got a lot going. I've got a bunch going on right now, so it's kind of like thinking ahead. It's not taking up much of my mental time, which maybe it should, but it's not, regrettably. So maybe I'll do the Maria Davana Headley Beowulf on Wednesdays, and then I could do Starship Troopers. I could. I've been sort of holding off on doing Starship Troopers because it's one of those cases where I think the wrong kinds of people like certain things. People, I think, got the wrong message from that book on both sides of any given ideological divide. I think it's much easier to just be like, "Hey, by the way, this is a science fiction novel. It's not meant to be being a platform." But whatever. It's fiction, guys. Don't think too much about it, please. It's an interesting thought process, whether you think it'd work at all. I mean, I had some running commentary during The Moon is a Harsh Mistress about how, oh, this seems nice, but it requires these extremely specific conditions, context, and circumstances to be viable. The whole moon rebelling thing and succeeding in its rebellion is kind of like, kind of good luck doing that now. It's pretty tough. But, if you just seize the means of production, badum-tish. Rise, proletariat! And so on and so forth. Because it's worked so well in the past. So well for everyone involved. And then doing the opposite has worked so well. Aggravation. Failing that, there's plenty of stuff I can do. Plenty of stuff that can be done. I'm still not, still not 100% sure what I wanted to plan to do. Hopefully, I will have the free time to spend mental cycles on figuring out what I'm going to do next, and we'll go from there. Otherwise, I'll just see to the pants it, and you'll get whatever I give you. And I don't know what that'll be yet. We'll find out at the time. There is this book by, I think they're a Finnish author. The book is called Termush, that I want to read. That looks pretty good. Fairly short. Seemed pretty neat. Someone recommended it. I forget who recommended it to me, and I've barely made any headway on it because I'm like reading 3 different books right now, as is, which I shouldn't be doing. I should be focusing my efforts. And I do want to read that one aloud already because I'm like, oh yeah, this is going to be interesting. Pretty good. It ties in pretty well to Radicalized, so if I have it finished by the time I'm done reading that, then we'll do that. Wow, and now like 10 people have
tuned in. That's cool. Sorry, guys, I'm ending right now, but you can watch this one from the beginning and catch up. Sorry. This is the post-game blather, as it were. Anyway, I'm gonna dip, get my taxes done, and well, some of my taxes done anyway. And yeah, see you all later. Stay safe as always. Stay sane as ever, and be decent to each other, or else. That's right. Or else. Or else I'll shout at you a lot. Yeah, that'll be effective. Yep. Yep. Definitely. For sure. All right. See you all later. Have a good one. It's been fun.